Hi, I'm Joshua Fielding from the Australasian Timber Flooring Association. Today's webinar is simply on timber flooring applications, but some have referred to this as the demystifying of timber floors. There are many different timber and timber-related flooring products in the market, and equally as many ways to install those floors. This webinar, along with a brochure of the same name, provides a way through the maze and specifically designed for specifiers, architects, builders and consumers who want to put all the pieces of puzzles together. The webinar also covers the important aspects that are needed with each flooring systems to get it right the first time. Today's webinar will be presented by David Hayward, ATFA Technical Manager, who's well known throughout the industry for providing guidance on timber flooring practices. If anyone would like to ask any questions during the webinar, please feel free to type them in, and at the end of the webinar, we'll put them forward to David Hayward. So please welcome Mr. David Hayward to present today's webinar. You there, David?
Yes, I am, Josh.
Excellent. I hear you loud and clear, and I'm just getting your page up for you right now.
Okay.
You're right to go.
Okay, well, on behalf of the Australasian Timber Flooring Association and Wood Solutions, I'd just like to welcome you this afternoon on this interesting topic of timber flooring applications and I suppose the other side of it, getting it right first time. So we certainly do have a lot of different flooring products out there in the marketplace, and of all different types, and sometimes it can become a little bit confusing. And so really what we want to do today is really to go through some of the important, well, firstly I suppose to just identify some of the products and the terminology that goes with them, but then to see, well, what are the important things about the installation of these floors. So today we'll be covering, looking at each of the what we call timber products or timber flooring products, and also the related products, those that have some characteristics of timber. Well, terminology, sometimes we talk about fixed floors and floating floors. I wonder what those things are. Structural and overlay flooring, what's the difference between those? We'll look at some common flooring systems and what's essential in if we're going to install by these systems, what's important. Providing for movement in both fixed and floors fixed to subfloors, and also floating floors. These are two aspects that are really quite critical in the performance of our flooring systems. And finally there, just a small section just to introduce you to some of the aspects of coatings. Okay, timber and related flooring products. Well, as I've just said, there's many different types of timber and timber-related products, and lots of products out there that want to look like timber. And some of those, as you'll see, are things like vinyl plank or even ceramic tiles that are made to look like timber. Well, those two don't have any commonality with timber, and those ones won't be covered. So let's have a look at what might be covered. But first we need to consider those obviously that have a wood or a fibre type component in their construction, as they share the common properties of, or some common properties with solid timber. And the most important property is what happens when we have seasonal changes in weather. And what we find is that when the humidity goes down, we have dry times during the year, that we find that all these products will shrink a little bit. They'll get narrower, the boards will get narrower. But if we go into very high humidity conditions, then each of those boards will expand a little bit. And it's really this expansion and shrinkage that needs to be accommodated. Now, if you look at the diagram on the right-hand side there, we see that if we look in the middle there, it's got a picture of a floorboard which says its cover width is 80 millimeters wide, its moisture content is 11%. And then besides that, it's saying the relative humidity of 60%. And what this is saying is that if I do have a relative humidity of 60% and a board in those conditions, it will just always stay at 11%, and its cover width will always be 80 millimeters. However, if I was to take that same board and put it into quite dry conditions at 40% relative humidity, which is at the top of the diagram, then what we would find is that the moisture from the timber will go out into the atmosphere, and as a result of this, the moisture content will go down, reduce from 11% to 8%, and the cover width will also reduce. Conversely, that board in the middle, if I took it up into a place which was really quite humid, well, what would happen is the moisture in the air would go into the board, increasing its moisture content, and its cover width would also change by increasing. Okay, so what are the product types that we're going to consider today? Well, here they are. Here's some photos of some, and when you look at the photos, you think, oh, they all look pretty much the same as far as appearance goes. So solid strip flooring, and sometimes we can have a pre-finished version of that. We can have engineered flooring, and also parquetry, and we'll look at those. Now, these are all mainly timber-related products. So they're solid timber all the way through. Sometimes the engineered flooring, they can have different backings on them, but most engineered flooring does have timber all the way through. And when we're talking about related products, so they're not, wouldn't specifically be called timber flooring, we're looking at laminate flooring, bamboo flooring, and cork tiles. So those are the flooring products that we'll be covering today. Now, sometimes we hear of terminology, oh, that's a floated floor, or that floor's, oh, that's a fixed floor. Well, the way to think about this is that fixed floors use nails and staples and adhesive, and each of the individual boards is connected onto the subfloor, and these boards will have a tongue and groove at board joints which fit together, and they'll be fastened or fixed onto the subfloor. And when talking about subfloors, we're talking about maybe plywood or particle board or concrete, something that has been fixed onto in some way. Now, a floating floor is really quite different. A floating floor has each board fixed to each adjacent board, but no fixing of the floorboards to the subfloor. So think on that. Each board's connected to the board next door, but there's no connection of those boards that are all fixed together onto the subfloor. So that creates a platform, or sometimes we call this a raft, and the raft we float on an underlay. Most flooring has an interlocking or glueless jointing system, but some do have a TNG profile and use adhesive in the board joints to hold the boards one to another. And if we look at those two photos, the top photo shows a standard tongue and groove profile, and the arrow there shows where adhesive is put, just usually underneath the groove edge of the board, and that glues one board to the other to form part of the raft. Otherwise, many systems are this glueless type jointing system, and you can see that system there, which the boards fold down into place and lock into place. Okay, so when it comes to fixed or floated installation, well, I wonder which products can be fixed, I wonder which ones can be floated, and I wonder which ones can be both. Well, to simplify this process, I've drawn out this little table for you. And so the top part of the table is, yes, our timber flooring products, and the bottom half is our related products. So with solid timber, pre-finished solid, parquetry, and cork, you will see that all these products are fixed rather than floated. None of them you'll find are floated. But when it comes to the related products, we know that, well, engineered, it's a solid timber type product, but it can be both fixed and floated, and so can bamboo flooring. It can be fixed and it can be floated. But a class on its own is laminate flooring, which is the complete opposite to solid, in which case it can be floated, but it cannot be fixed. So let's have a look at some of our floated floors. So here's a photo of some engineered floating floor, a bamboo floating floor, and a laminate floating floor. And again, you can see, even though each one is different in its construction and its makeup, appearance-wise, there can be a lot of similarities. So when it comes to floating floors, you'll also find that they make there's a little bit of difference in the sound when you walk across them. And if you're walking across the floor and trying to decide, is this a floated floor or is it a fixed floor? Well, if you just tap the floor with your shoe, you'll hear maybe a sound that it's not a dull sound. And if it's not a dull sound, it's likely to be a floating floor. But if it's quite a dull sound, then it's more likely to be a fixed floor. There are also some little differences between these products types too, which can help us identify them. Okay, so that's about fixed and floated floors, but another lot of terminology that gets bandied around is structural and overlay floors. What's the difference between a structural floor and an overlay floor? Well, a structural floor, as probably as the name suggests, is that it can support people walking on it when it's fixed directly into joists or battens. So on the left-hand side there, we have a photo and it shows some floor joists there, and you can see how the floorboards are directly connected onto the top of those floor joists. So that's a structural floor. And most floors today, however, are overlay floors, whereby the flooring is laid on a structural subfloor, such as particle board, plywood, or concrete. And the bottom photo there shows a floor that's been laid with a full bed of adhesive onto plywood, and they spread out maybe 600 millimeters of adhesive in front of them, and then they put the boards into that adhesive. And in that case there, they'll also be secretly fixing with staples the boards into the plywood. So with timber flooring, solid timber flooring, you have a minimum thickness of 19 millimeters for it to be a structural product. But also note that you could also, in the bottom photo there, that's likely to be also 19 millimeters thick, and it's been used as an overlay. So structural flooring must be at least 19 millimeters thick, but overlay flooring, well, it could be 12 millimeters thick, 14 millimeters thick, 19 millimeters thick. So therefore it doesn't necessarily relate directly to the thickness. It's the way that it is laid and what it is laid on. Okay, so let's have a closer look at some of our timber flooring products. And I suppose the first on the list is always going to be solid strip timber flooring. And as I've already said, they can be laid on joists or battens or as an overlay floor. And in some locations, and particularly over in Perth, they're directly adhesive fixed onto concrete. Floors can be top, and sometimes we call this face nailing. They can be top nail or face nail, or they can be secretly fixed, where the fixing goes down through the tongue below the board surface and into the subfloor. And generally there's going to be a combination of adhesives used in that type of installation. The other thing about solid timber flooring is that they're often rejuvenated and repaired and that by sanding and refinishing. And really, if you've got a floor that might be 10 years old and looking fairly dark and needing a bit of a refurbishment and that sort of thing, once it's resanded and coated, it can bring it back to near new condition. So that's our site sanded and coated solid strip timber flooring. Now, a close relation to this is pre-finished solid strip timber flooring. So the only difference really in the wording there is that word pre-finished. So instead of putting the boards down and site sanding and coating them, then in this case the boards come already with a coating on the top. So don't need to sand and finish on site. Now, sometimes these boards can have what we call a square edge. In other words, it's I suppose a rectangular, a complete rectangular type edge to the board, or right angle edge to the board. But often the term is often called arrest, or it's got a beveled edge, and this means that the sharp edge is taken off, and sometimes it's just rounded over a bit. Sometimes it might be a little bit of a V groove, and this sort of defines the edge of the board, but allows for a little bit of mismatch, a little bit of unevenness that can occur at board edges to be disguised. And so if you look on the right hand side there, up at the top there's a solid timber floor, which is smooth from board edge to board edge because it's been sanded on site. And down the bottom there is a pre-finished solid overlay floor, in which case you can see how the board joints are defined. And so generally with pre-finished solid timber flooring, it is going to be site sanded and, it's going to be sorry, I got on to the next slide. If it was pre-finished flooring, it's going to not be site sanded and coated, and therefore it doesn't need to have that work done afterwards. And so when the glue in that cures, it's available to be walked on. So that reduces the time frame a little bit. Now, getting on to our next slide, we're talking here about now engineered flooring and parquetry. So firstly, if we look at engineered flooring, it's manufactured with a decorative layer of solid timber. Now, so we've got a layer of solid timber, and sometimes some companies call that a veneer, and other companies might call it a lamella. We sometimes probably think of a veneer as being thinner and a lamella being thicker, but there's a crossover in the middle where it can be called one or the other. And it's bonded over layers of beneath, and usually these layers are timber. It could be a plywood type layer or other pieces of timber. So this provides some additional stability in the shrinkage and expansion in the width of the board. And the layers underneath are what's called cross-laminated. In other words, they go in both directions across the board and down the length of the board in various layers. And we'll have a look at that a bit more closely. So often these products are factory finished, but not always. But they can be done so both the grain and the texture are quite apparent. And if you look on the right hand side there, you'll see that what's been a limed floor, and it's been wire brushed, and it's actually got an oak lamella on it. So you can see the sort of the texture in the boards and the grain showing with that. So pre-finished floating engineered floors are ready to walk on after installation, and that's can be a real benefit. So in and out very quickly. And also very much the look of solid timber as well. You'll find that some also are manufactured to be site sanded and coated to even look more like a solid timber floor, but having the extra benefit of some extra stability. When it comes to parquetry, it comes in both block forms and also what's called mosaic. But really, mosaic is maybe if you go into an old town hall, you might see it, or some places that are fairly old. But it's not really that common nowadays. It's still around to a certain extent. And the thing about parquetry, you can combine these blocks in so many different ways to give you so many different patterns, and really some of them can be quite stunning when you mix both pattern and species together, and can be laid on lots of different subfloors, which is, I suppose, similar to solid timber flooring, and also can be easily rejuvenated by sanding. So in the photo there, you see some block parquetry, and here we've got, I think it's ironbark, the main block pieces, and the little dots are probably blackbutt, I think. And you know, and this is in a restaurant type environment. So a very good sort of a product, quite a robust sort of a product. Now, the next one we want to have a talk about is cork tiles. Now, cork, well, it's not really timber, but it is the bark of a tree, and it gets made into, I suppose, a tile type form that can be adhered to the subfloor or a rigid type underlay. So once the cork goes down, it's been stuck down, it's slightly sanded and it's coated, and it provides this natural looking and really quite a durable type surface. So cork doesn't really shrink and swell like the other products, any of the other products. And so as you can see in the photo there, that once you've got your, for argument's sake, your polyurethane coating over the top of it, and there's no movement underneath, that really creates a complete sheet over the top, which is very impervious to fluid spills and things like that. And of course, being a little bit softer as well, it's also, you don't break things when you drop things on cork, so that's an added benefit from that product. Now, if we look at some of the other related type products, laminate flooring. Well, is this timber or is it not timber? Well, the answer is that what you're seeing is not timber. It's actually a photographic image of some timber, and so in a laminate floor you'll see that the patterns actually do repeat. You've got that board down there, and if you look across the floor you'll see another board with exactly the same grain structure and pattern. So the photographic image is onto high density fiberboard, which is really quite a good stable sort of a product, and over the top of that, what we call the decor layer is the hard wearing melamine layer. Now, melamine's the same sort of stuff as you put on bench tops and things like that, so it's a very, very serviceable type layer that goes on top of our laminate floors. You'll find that almost universally nowadays the boards have a glueless jointing system, and as I said before, these floors are only floated, and you float them on a foam underlay of usually around about 2 to 3 millimeters. And again, the floor's ready to walk on once it's been installed. It's a great range of timber patterns. You can get longer board lengths now, and even they're managing to texture the surface. So if you have a look at the photo there, you can see that the surface of the board is textured partly in line with the grain, and also to make other sort of patterns to give, in this case, a more rusticated type appearance. So we see certainly with laminate flooring, there's lots of changes happening, and things are changing in that field quite a bit. Now, another related product is bamboo, and I suppose it's important to realise that bamboo is not timber, but it's a grass. But like timber, it's manufactured in board form and shares some of the characteristics of solid timber. It can be coloured, so you can get it in all sorts of different colours, as you see in the bottom photo there, and even textured, again, as in the bottom photo there. Most of the bamboo flooring that we see being laid is what's called strand woven, and this is where they cut the bamboo up into long strands, and then they add adhesive to it and press it into either a sheet or into a beam, usually into a beam, and that beam is then cut and machined into flooring. So, but that's I suppose isn't all the bamboo that's out there. And on the top right-hand side there, you'll see what's called horizontally laminated bamboo. And this is where they take the little pieces of bamboo, they change them into being rectangles, and then they glue them all together. And so that's horizontally laminated. And if we were to put the strips in the other direction, you would have what we call vertically laminated bamboo. So there's a little bit of that there on the market, and creates quite a different and impressive looking floor. And what you'll also find is that really the vast majority of bamboo flooring products are pre-finished. So they've been coated in the factory. A lot nowadays have a glueless jointing system, so you click them together and they will be floated on a foam underlay. Okay, so we've now had a look at our various different products. We've discussed whether they're floated or whether they're fixed. We've spoken about overlay flooring and structural flooring, and we've looked at our timber products and our timber-related products. Now, it's a case of looking at some installation essentials, and these are just 3 key points that you really need to keep in your head and just think about. And the 3 key steps to a successful project is firstly to know your product, secondly know your installation environment, and thirdly taking the above 1 and 2 into consideration. So what does it mean to know your product? Well, every product has its different requirements, and it's necessary to be familiar with both manufacturer and industry information pertaining to the product. So read the information sheet that comes with it, and that helps you to come to understand your product. Know your installation environment. Now, this can be a little bit harder for people who are not, fully immersed in installing flooring, but it is paramount that the subfloor and the subfloor conditions are correct. In other words, if we're going to lay it on top of a subfloor, we need to make sure that subfloor is right. Similarly, some places in Australia are quite dry, others places are quite humid. Some places have a lot of heating, other places have a lot of cooling. And this also changes the internal environment, and therefore changes the humidity type conditions, which is going to cause movement in our boards, our shrinkage and our swelling at various times of the year. And so it's necessary to ensure that the product is suited for this in-service environment, or that steps are taken to ensure that it is. So once you know about what product you're laying and where it's good to be laid, and that yes, you can lay it in accordance with the manufacturer and industry recommendations, and you've taken into consideration the subfloor and where it's going to be laid, then you can go ahead and lay that floor with confidence. Okay, let's have a look at some common flooring systems. And firstly, we'll start off with solid strip timber flooring. which can be over concrete slabs and also on joists or battens. And the top diagram there on the top left-hand side looks at a solid timber floor on plywood over concrete. Now, some important things there. So the subfloor is the plywood, and so therefore the flooring on top is overlay flooring. Now, you'll see there that the flooring is secret fixed with a trail bed of adhesive, but closer to the wall where they can't get the secret nailer in, they need to top nail those boards, and they'd have putty on top. Now, underneath the plywood, there's a little black line in there, and this is actually a moisture vapor barrier. It's in this case, it could be an applied one, but in this case, it shows it as being black plastic. Black plastic is a very good way of preventing any possible moisture from the slab interfering with the floor. And you'll also note that it comes up to at least the height of the floor at the wall plates. And on the right-hand side of that diagram, it shows a floor that might be, directly fixed to concrete. And this is what happens over in Perth, but really not on the eastern side of Australia. On the eastern side, we tend to put it on plywood, and it's only that Perth has a particular climate that enables it, that method of installation to work successfully. Now, underneath that, we've got a batten subfloor on concrete, and we've got boards of different sizes there. We can, again, you've got the black plastic, polythene moisture vapor barrier, 200 microns thick across the slab. You've got your battens being spiked down into the slab, and you've got your timber flooring on top. Now, if it's going to be top nailed, then you're going to need a thicker batten, and if it's a wider board, then sometimes people prefer to top nail those boards. And if it's thinner flooring and not quite as wide, and we can use a thinner batten, which is usually a hardwood batten that can be secret fixed into that. So that shows two other methods of installing over concrete. But again, we can also install over timber floor joists, and usually nowadays this is onto a subfloor of particle board or plywood. And really, you can see that the fixing method there is really quite similar to the plywood subfloor on concrete. The only difference is that generally on joists, we expect dry conditions underneath that floor, in which case we wouldn't have a moisture barrier as we do with concrete. So that's our solid timber flooring fixing methods. Now if we go on and look at floating floors and floated floors on a foam underlay. So initially you can see, oh yes, there's the blue foam underlay there, and generally this will have a moisture vapor barrier as part of that underlay, and it needs to be at least 150 microns of plastic. Now sometimes underlays don't have anything, in which case most manufacturers say, well, hey, you need to put black plastic down over the slab first before you use the underlay, and even some will say if the conditions, if you're uncertain about the conditions, do that anyway. And so in there we see, again, we've got some expansion joints in there, and the room for expansion on either side there underneath the skirting, and quads or beading put around maybe kitchen benches and things like that. And so that shows also generally where it goes up to maybe carpet and the types of trims that are used in that type of installation process. Now a lot of floors also go into high-rise buildings, and we need to have acoustic type underlays to be used in conjunction with these. So solid timber flooring, strip flooring, will generally be laid on plywood over the acoustic underlay, whereas engineered and parquetry might be directly adhesive fixed onto the underlay. And note with parquetry there's a specific underlay that's used which is a little bit firmer because the blocks don't have a tongue and groove on them. And also with the engineered is usually directly adhesive fixed onto the acoustic underlay. You'll see some other little bits and pieces in there. You've got those quads and things, and different from the previous drawing, we've got we've got these foam backing rods to stop noise. You'll see that the quads are just slightly higher than the floor, so noise won't transfer from the floor into the skirting or the quad and into the wall. You need everything isolated, and also those foam rods to also assist with that. Okay, so we've spoken a little bit about movement and expansion, and providing for floor expansion is one of the keys to ongoing success with a floor installation. And there's a term that we need to sort of understand to come to terms with this, and to a degree we've already looked at it a little bit, and the term is equilibrium moisture content. And the equilibrium moisture content is the moisture content that timber approaches under set conditions of relative humidity and temperature. And so with our diagram on the right there, and you'll see the table values there. We've got in the red boxes, we've got 11% moisture content at 20 degrees C. It will maintain 11% at 60% relative humidity. Now, if I had a piece of flooring that was under 40% relative humidity and 20 degrees C, and had been there for a long time, and it was only sitting close to 8% moisture content, and I put it in conditions of 60% relative humidity, then it would increase its moisture content until it got up to close to 11%. So you can see that if our EMC is 11% and we've got flooring that is lower moisture content than 11%, then it will tend to swell until it gets up close to 11%. And conversely, if we've got some timber at 16% moisture content and it goes into conditions of 60% relative humidity, then it will shrink until its moisture content gets close to 11%. So you can think that, well, humidity changes all the time and houses a little bit more stable, but there are seasonal changes usually between summer and winter, and periods when houses are heated and cooled, and that will differ around the country. So just on that, so solid timber flooring is manufactured at a moisture content of 10 to 11% because it's going to suit an internal environment somewhere between 55 and 60% relative humidity. And you can see that there on the chart at 20 degrees C, 60% relative humidity, and we have 11% moisture content there, and if it was 55% relative humidity, about 10%. And so manufacturers manufacture flooring which is basically going to suit pretty much the internal climates. Now in Melbourne, with winter heating and dry summers, the internal humidity's around about 50 to 55%, and so solid timber flooring can be a little bit prone to showing a little bit of shrinkage under that type of environment. But the same boards in Brisbane, well, we've got warmer, moderately humid summers, and internal relative humidities of maybe 55 to 65%, and those floors can be expected to be more prone to a little bit of swelling under humid times. So therefore, with solid timber flooring, to minimise the movement after installation, it's necessary to install flooring as close as possible to the average internal EMC of the dwelling. Because this cannot be accurately predicted, we need to allow for some movement after installation. So when we lay a floor, I'm not quite sure whether it's exactly what its initial moisture content was or what the conditions are really going to be like in the home. And this is why we have to allow for some movement after installation. Okay, and this is where acclimatisation comes in. And many people have heard of this word acclimatisation, but sadly to say, a lot of people think they're doing the right thing, but may not necessarily be doing the right thing. So acclimatisation has a purpose, and the purpose is this is with solid timber flooring, has the purpose of adjusting the average moisture content of the flooring to be closer to its expected in-service average moisture content prior to laying. And this is going to reduce the post-installation shrinkage in dry climates and the post-installation expansion in humid climates. If the conditions are not suitable or are at an extreme for that location, then acclimatisation can result in performance concerns. Now, I often get called up and people phone me up and say, isn't it mandatory that you have to acclimatise the flooring? Well, just think on this. If your flooring has been manufactured for, which is going to suit conditions of 10 to 12.5%, and your expected in-service environment is also 10 to 12.5%, well, there's no real special need to acclimatise it. You can just go ahead and lay the floor. But if you're in quite a dry sort of a climate, and a moist climate, and you know, you've got your flooring at maybe 10 or 11% moisture content, and you expect it to go up to 14% after it's been laid. Well, that's a good time that you might want to consider acclimatizing it to bring it closer to what it's its average moisture content on installation prior to laying it. And conversely, that's the same for dry type conditions. So acclimatization, it has a purpose. And it's not just sticking it in the house for 2 weeks or 6 weeks or whatever. It has a purpose, and you need to think about that and have it acclimatized under the right conditions if you're going to use that method to reduce the amount of movement after installation. Okay, so expansion allowance for floors fixed to the subfloor. So here we're talking about solid, pre-finished, solid parquetry, engineered and bamboo. All these are fixed to can be fixed to the subfloor. So with seasonal highs and lows in humidity, flooring will swell and shrink. Solid timber does not shrink or swell appreciably in length, but engineered and bamboo move in both width and length. So with these different types of products, we get some different types of characteristics. And due to house design, location, heating and cooling systems, seasonal variations differ, and the exact movement is difficult to predict. And again, this is the reason why we need to have expansion or maybe even shrinkage allowance, if you want to think of it that way as well. So this is added to the floor perimeter around all vertical surfaces, and with wider floors, there's greater expansion. Then we also need to consider intermediate expansion allowance. And so sometimes it's just a case of looking at this. Where is this house? And well, it could be maybe not everywhere in Australia, but it's obviously, you know, very green around here. We've got a few palm trees and that sort of thing. And I wonder how much sun that house gets. Well, probably not a lot. And if I took a moisture meter and looked at some of these timbers and that sort of thing, I might find that they're quite high. So this is naturally quite a high humidity environment. If we write on the sea like this, and the doors are often open and that sort of thing to take benefit of the sea breeze, well, that also would be a higher humidity type environment. And this is how we can, you know, think about where the floor's going and what it's likely to do. So expansion allowance for, again, for floors fixed to subfloors. How do we do it? Well, site sanded and coated solid strip floors and some parquetry floors, noting that the pattern also helps distribute things. We'll generally use cork or regular gaps, maybe every 8 or 10 boards or something rather like that. And with pre-finished solid, then gaps are used. Now, a lot of people say, oh, but look, maybe what's a cork joint going to look in my floor? Am I really is it going to stand out? Well, you can see here, looking at this floor, this light coloration down or lighter coloration down here is actually the cork joint. And I've taken a blow up of that so that you can see it. So cork joints that are done well in solid timber floors are really, they blend in with the floor usually pretty well. Now, with wide and long adhesive fixed engineered floors, intermediate expansion allowance is also necessary, both in the width and the length. And this is very much the same for bamboo as well. So irrespective of the flooring type, yes, we do need to expansion allowance. Now, floating floors. Now, we knew that floating floors are a little bit different, aren't they? Because what happens with a floating floor is that we connect all the boards together, one to the other, and so effectively we're creating these rafts which we float on a foam underlay. And so it's not so much about what's happening with the boards, the individual boards, whether they're going to be shrinking and swelling. It's actually because they're all joined together, it's the movement of the raft that must be accommodated. And raft movement can be quite significant. And there will be, seasonal changes. It will expand at some times of the year, and other times of the year the raft will shrink in both width and length with these products. And so with floating floors, we speak of this wonderfully long word called compartmentalization. Great word, isn't it? And this is really making the floor up into a number of smaller rafts, another smaller compartments joined together by expansion and control joints using trims. So if we look at this floor on the right here, we can see that, well, this is all our floor area through here, but we can break that up into one raft, a second raft, and a third raft, each by these control joints, because each of these floor areas is going to try and shrink and swell from the center here. And so therefore, to allow movement both across and in and out at this point here, because this raft's going to move differently to that raft, we need to have a control joint or an expansion joint here. And similarly, we would do the same over there. And if we did not, the movement of one raft area can interfere with the movement of another raft area. And that then can create some problems in our timber floor or our floor installation. So again, providing for this movement, as I said, each raft expands in both width and length depending on the weather conditions. And the problems that can occur if we don't separate these floor areas out or put enough expansion allowance around benches and things like that, we can have buckling of the floor, we can get separation at board joints, and with buckling we can introduce some squeaks and things, and sometimes the floor can move out from beneath skirtings. And of course, where seasonal movement is greater, then greater allowance for raft movement is needed. And this might be wider skirting boards or even creating smaller rafts to overcome that. And again, with floating floors, be aware that you can't put heavy benches on top of them, because this is going to stop the natural movement of the raft from the center of the floor area. So pool tables, kitchen benches, very heavy objects like that, well, no, we don't put them on floated floors. We put beading around and create expansion allowance around it. Now, I said we'd finally finish off with a little bit on coatings and stains, and I suppose what I want to raise here that really this is another whole area, but it's important to realise that we do have a lot of coating types out there. And down this end, we've got penetrating oils, hard wax oils, oil alkyds, often referred to as tung oils, and oil modified urethanes. So you can see one common word in there: oil, 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 oil. Now, oils tend to penetrate down into the timber, and they'll give us a more subdued look. And but we see this one here, oil modified urethane. Well, if we've got oil and urethane, well, we get some penetration, but we also get some of the properties of urethanes on that. Acid catalyzed coatings, they've got some similar characteristics to oil modified urethanes. And then we've got the other one, which we're probably more common with, the solvent-borne polyurethanes and the waterborne polyurethanes. So what we need to realise is that some coating systems are more hard wearing, but maybe not as easy to repair. Some are better for certain installation environments. Some are better with some timbers than others. The coated appearance differs between the types and differs over time. So therefore, it's really worthwhile with the coating side of things. Grab a brochure on it and learn to understand it a little bit more. The ATFA does have brochures on its website covering coating choice. And really before deciding on a finishing system, make sure that it's going to be right for your floor. And this is a case of really knowing the benefits and limitations. And really, even though we've got so many coatings out here, each is going to give a different appearance, and each is going to maybe wear a little bit differently. And it's really a balance of these and other factors that you need to put together to say, well, yes, I've taken all these things into account, and this is the right coating for me. Okay, so if we were to look at what some of these appearances might look like. So we've got our hard wax oil. So this is in this area here, and you can see this here is a floor. It's in a restaurant, and it's got hard wax oil on it. Okay, you can see because it's the wax bit in there is giving it a little bit of a sheen, whereas if it was just a penetrating oil, it would be even a duller finish. And this floor here, okay, obviously quite a commercial type environment, and we've got a water-based polyurethane. So that's up from this sort of area, a medium sort of a sheen to that one. But we've also got the possibility of doing other things with site sanded and coated floors. In this case here, we've got this one here that's been had a lime wash put it on it, and also a white oil, and then it will have probably had polyurethane top coatings on it. So there's some examples of what some of these finishes can look like, and it's really just a case of working through the process and deciding which one might be best for you. Okay, so some final words. Okay, what have we covered? Well, we've covered a lot of areas there, haven't we? We've covered a bit of terminology and way things should be fixed, standard fixing processes, and finally finishing off with a little bit on coatings. So the main keys to success are knowing your product and checking it prior to laying. Be confident through assessment that your subfloor is right to accept the floor, and then laying the floor to suit the requirements of the product for the installation environment it is being laid in. That is just paramount. If you get the right product and you put it on a subfloor that you know is right, and you take into account what you expect it to move and put in the appropriate expansion allowance, you're well on the way to have a floor that's going to be a very successful installation. Okay, so provision for floor movement after installation is a must. It's not an option. All these products will move a little bit. High humidity, they will swell a little bit. Low humidity, they'll shrink a little bit. If they're a floating floor, that's the raft that will be moving. If it's a stick down floor, then we're more concerned a little bit what happens with individual boards. Okay, the other side of it is there are recognised systems and installation methods that are out there, and those that work and assist to ensure success with each and every floor installation is when you use such recognised installation methods. Okay, Josh, well that brings us to the conclusion of our webinar today, and I was just wondering if there was perhaps any questions.
We're all good, Dave. I think we've gone through really successful. We don't have any questions today, so I want to thank you for today's webinar. There will be a recording of today's webinar put up on the ATFA website, which is www.atfa.com.au. For all our up and coming events with the ATFA, please keep a lookout on our two websites, floorchoices.com.au and atfa.com.au. And please like our social media pages on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. So if anyone has any questions regarding today's webinar, you can send me an email at josh@atfa.com.au or to David, DAVID, @atfa.com.au. I'd like to thank you all very much for listening to today's webinar. From Dave and myself, have a great afternoon or evening, depending where you're listening from. Goodbye for now.